Slideshow, and we're going to play the slideshow. Thank you for your patience.
Welcome to the Nomad MFA webinar. I'm glad you can join us. This is Carol Padberg speaking to you. As I was putting together this webinar, I was thinking about what you would want to know by the time we're done. So you probably are curious about what this program is and who it's made for and how it works and where you go on the residencies of this low-res program. You're probably curious about the faculty and what the students do. But I thought it would be interesting for me to share with you some of the questions I had as I was founding the program. One of my guiding questions was, what if an MFA program consisted of reciprocity between students in an MFA program and the places and people that they encountered? An example I'd like to talk about that's an example of reciprocity is the first summer in the program, students built a cob oven for members of a community garden in Hartford. And so here you see the cob oven, which was built on site at the community garden. And you can see that it is protected by a pavilion. And if you look really closely, you can see that that is built with pegs and a very old style of architecture. So the pavilion was made in Rhinebeck in a forest wood shop using these tools that are very kind of basic. We felled the tree, the students learned how to make the pegs and also built some of their own tools. And then they brought the pieces back to Hartford and finished the pavilion in our wood shop at the Hartford Art School, working with Colin McMullen, who designed this whole class. And then they built the cob oven with Matteo Lundgren, you see here in the hat. And we were connecting what was going on in terms of creating this public space with a book by Eleanor Ostrom, Governing the Commons, with this consideration of commons versus privatized spaces. Another question, what if alongside the question, who are you, we asked, where are you? What you see here is Mona Smith's Bedote Memory Map website. And this is a website that helps people understand Minnesota as a Dakota place. Our students start their residencies in Minnesota with the Bedote Walk. Here you see Ramona Quito Stately guiding our students through an exploration of several places over the course of a day. These are places of birthing, places of funeral rites, places of cosmological importance, and also some really difficult places of genocide, including Fort Snelling. What if considering where you are also includes making things that connect to worldviews of the people who have lived there the longest? Ramona Quito Stately, who you saw earlier, teaches our students beading. And here's an example of a beaded pipe bag that was made in the class with Ramona. And while we were beading, we were also discussing the book, What This All Means, a feminist archaeology at a Wahpeton, Dakota village. And this is a really interesting account of an archaeologist with a very traditional training meeting the people who live in the area now, who are the descendants of the people who lived at the site that she was studying. So what does it mean to an archaeologist when she meets the great-great-grandchildren of the people whose homes she's excavating? And of course, these people are Ramona Quito Stately's family members, and she lives very close to this site. Another question, what if an MFA included making art for non-human audiences? In this case, students created a solitary bee habitat, an architecturally scaled one, with Emily Putoff and Jen Wooden of the Hudson Valley Bee Habitat. This was in Rhinebeck, New York. And this is an example of one of the bees that is of the sort, native bees that use these habitats. And here you see the completed habitat. And in the picture on the left is Linda Weintraub, who is a generous faculty member in our program and invites the students to spend time on her land, in her home, and in her studio as she teaches an art and ecology class. So the Technolab class is paired with the art and ecology class. And on the slide, on the picture on the upper right, you can see the whole group working with Emily and Jen. And then cohort members the following year built a water filtration system and garden that purified water for a bee beach. What if we traded in the gray cube of the university classroom for example, the Everglades swamps, or a Central American village, or the high desert of New Mexico, or the rising waters of Miami? We're thinking about what are the implications if we leave behind the sterility of a university and the way we are ourselves in a university for places where we are guests and visitors and learners together in a learning community. So on the left here, you see Mark Dion teaching in the Everglades, literally in the Everglades. Notice the water level is between knee and thigh high. And here we were taking a walk through the Everglades, considering that ecosystem. This is a village in El Salvador. We invited the Panchimalco weavers to teach our students backstrap weaving. This was also an example of reciprocity, as the teaching kits of backstrap looms that we made are now part of learning curriculum for backstrap weaving. So we also, as part of this sense of place and engaged pedagogy, we pace the learning so that after a particularly intensive class of a few days, you might have the following few days doing something like this backstrap weaving, which allows you to think about what you've learned, have informal conversations about it while you're working with your hands. So there's a somatic aspect to integrating the knowledge. What if sometimes the classroom was ancestral caves? Here's Roxanne Swentzel in New Mexico taking us into the caves where her ancestors lived in the high desert of New Mexico. Roxanne was teaching the students a distinguished practitioner class on ceramics in the Puebloan tradition, and that included digging the clay, making seed pots, learning how to fire the clay, and applying concepts of the honorable harvest. We did this while we were camping together in the high desert and also eating the traditional Puebloan diet. An unexpected surprise was Roxanne inviting us into her home to grind corn. And so there's an aspect to this teaching which is really engaged. We have experiences in a living classroom that allows a different type of relationship to flourish. And what if students could immerse themselves in an artist's practice to see how things work behind the scenes, to see the world behind the finished work? You see here students performing in a piece that was a land dive, which is part of Hope Ginsberg's practice. She taught a distinguished practitioner class in Miami, and as part of that class, students meditated each day. Meditation is foundational to the land dive performances, and so students were learning all kinds of things related to what went into the work, also the logistics of getting all of the scuba gear, how you plan for the sites, and I think the students learned so much in each of our distinguished practitioner classes. What if theory could be brought into close contact with practical considerations? Caroline Willard and Lee-Claire LaBerge teach a class on art and economies, and this class spans reading economic theory and also looking at personal project budgets. An image from that class focusing on solidarity economies, and an example from the syllabus of what students did. And you can see that often the class would start with somatic activities, do some reading, some discussion, take a break, have some reflection and synthesis time. And this class was held at the Commons, which is one of the institutions that's part of the solidarity economy in New York City. So we really like to support those institutions and connect how we teach the classes with our own ethics. So how does this really work? The program is an MFA that lasts 26 months. It's an accredited program. It's a low residency program. It uses this living classroom pedagogy. You've seen a lot of examples of that so far. And we have an expanded curriculum that I'll get to in the next slide. It includes a lot of classes that you wouldn't find in a more traditional MFA. And we wrap it all up by considering how we want to embody and teach a philosophy of regenerative culture. So what's regenerative culture? I think of it as a mix of critical analysis, ethics, ecological awareness, but most of all the ability to muck in and to really engage with the most troubling, challenging, and emerging issues of our time. Here you get a glimpse of how it actually works through the curriculum. You can see the titles of the classes and when they are offered through the residencies. And here is an example of the pacing. So in the summer, we spend 3 weeks in the field, and then in the fall semester, students have advising every 3 weeks with their thesis advisor. That gives you a good deadline to increase the production in your studio, to connect readings you're being assigned with what you're doing, to do some writings about your work. You're also taking these classes which allow you to do the preliminary studies before residencies or the wrap-up work after your residency. And then students are also exchanging feedback on each other's work through virtual studio visits. In the winter, there are 2 weeks in the field, so a 2-week residency, and then again, those 3 things during the following semester. You're advising, your work critiquing each other, and also the courses. As far as where we go, all of our sites are in the Americas. Our students come from all over, but our residency sites are all in the Americas. You can see there's a cluster of East Coast sites, the Hudson Valley, New York City, Hartford. And then there's Miami, Florida, Minneapolis, Minnesota, New Mexico, Oakland, Oaxaca, San Salvador, and Cotopequi in El Salvador. We have an amazing roster of artists who teach in our program. They draw on their own lives as artists and incredible production in terms of what they do and how they do it. Examples of people teaching in our program: Nico Whedon. Here she was teaching a professional practices class in 2016 at the Studio Museum of Harlem. Linda Weintraub, teaching art and ecology. She's written several books while working with our students in the program. And again, she opens up her home and studio and land to us for 1 week as one of our residency sites in Rhinebeck. Pablo Helguera, who has visited our program twice. Here he's having dinner with students in our first cohort, and then last summer he taught in the program and included the students in a performance at the New Britain Museum of American Art. Ernesto Pujol taught in our program the first 3 years, and here is teaching Art in Place Hartford. Richard Holland teaching Art in Place Reconsidered Hartford last summer. Pedro Lash teaching in Oaxaca this past fall. And I also want to mention that we work with a tremendous group of non-artists who are part of our teaching team. These include herbalists, storytellers, healers, all kinds of people who have information that is vital to the students, but are outside of the art world. A really important part of the teaching team at Nomad MFA are our thesis advisors. And in the photo here with the two women with the program bags, on the left is Christy Gast, and on the right is Mary Mattingly. When I think about their thesis advising, I think about critical analysis, firm guidance, generosity, and the incredible care that they bring to their job. They really ask a lot of the students, and they bring their own incredible range of practice, of interdisciplinary practice to each student's work. So critiques are an important part of each residency. We rent critique spaces, and here you see a critique happening in Miami, and then again in Hartford. So these are often long format critiques that really allow the nuances of your practice and the span of potentials in your practice to be addressed. I want to take a moment to think about our students. Generally, our students are working full-time while being full-time graduate students. They need a kind of flexibility of hours so that they can do this program asynchronously when we're not together on residency. What that means is that when you do your coursework is up to you. There are very few times where a whole class needs to meet together. There are a few times like this, but for the online classes, of which there are two, there's usually more asynchronous learning. Our students are really interested in bringing what they learned back to their home community, and often they're choosing a low residency program so that they can continue with their deep engagement with the places where they live. They often have lots of commitments in terms of professional and family and community commitments. They're often interested in new pedagogies, and they're eager to travel. They're self-starters. They have to be very organized and very adaptive. Having said all of that, it's hard to generalize about our students because we attract a very diverse group of artists with different practices from different parts of the world. We've had students from Saudi Arabia, France, Ghana, Hong Kong, Singapore, Brazil, lots of different places with lots of different points of view. And that makes for a very dynamic learning group. I'm going to wrap up with some examples of the students' work, 4 examples from Cohort 1 and 4 examples from Cohort 2. Desiree Duell is our first artist we're going to look at. For her thesis exhibition, she had created an artwork of her home, where each room in her home in Flint, Michigan, was about the water crisis, about the realities and traumas of living in Flint, low income, and dealing with the layers of what that experience entails. So each room in her house was an artwork, and for her thesis exhibition, she had a live stream from that house into the gallery. She is now a real estate agent and artist in Flint, Michigan. And I think that's a really interesting example of how the program allows artists to develop art that is most meaningful for them, and we are really creative in ways that we can do this across distances. Here's also a detail from her project. Rory Sparks created a project called Working Library. This is a community center and printmaking center in Portland, Oregon. And this is a place where people can share knowledge, create books, and share skills. And over the course of her working on this project and getting this place up and running in Portland, a nonprofit purchased Working Library. So when the time came for her to have her exhibition, she checked it out from the organization and brought it to Hartford. You can see how she documents the projects. It's through this card catalog. It's also really interesting that the nonprofit that bought the project also hired her, so now she's employed by her work, so to speak. So we really try to foster ways that students can be very open in terms of how they're thinking about the possibilities for earning an income, keeping yourself afloat, and making your art all together. This is Benjamin Howe, and his project from Hong Kong addressed foraging and local plants, eating and learning about local plants through direct contact with them in urban spaces. He, as part of his project, developed these workshops where participants would create pages on each plant and illustrate them, learn the names of these plants you see every day but might not understand. Here he's conducting a workshop with students in Connecticut. Another student, Andrew Esch, his project connected thinking about the networks of human communications via the internet with the networks of mycelial communications underground. And he created these sculptures in which there was programming that printed messages from the forest, and it was interactive where you could be creating content through the mycelia. And he's a master woodworker who's also an incredible educator and is employed as a museum educator. In Cohort 2, we're going to look at work by Patrick Bouon, Blair Butterfield, Zahar Al-Dabakh, and Sophie Tuttle. And on the left, each cohort gets a catalog of their work when their thesis exhibition comes along. And that's a nice printed catalog that you can take with you when you graduate and kind of helps you bridge into your post-grad school career. Zahar Al-Dabakh created these meditational video media spaces where, in this case, there were these flipping pages of books about behavior in Saudi Arabia, and her work primarily addresses systems of culture, religion, and conduct. And here's another example of her work. There was projections of embers burning down, and then this ash from incense. Patrick Bouon, her thesis included performance work that was shown by video, and also textile sculptural pieces. And she developed a persona and did these performances. Her work addressed the need to more deeply consider waste and trash and ecological implications of trash in her home country of Ghana. Blair Butterfield is an educator, a photographer, an artist who's thinking about how we can perform magic and learn about our local world through rituals and also deep consideration of place. And here's a detail of her work. And then Sophie Tuttle used the concept of solastalgia, a grieving that's related to climate disruption and extinctions. And she developed a book on this as a guide for people to help them with their solastalgia. And she also developed this expansive installation. So I'm going to wrap it up here as far as my presentation. I think you can see in these examples how this is really an interdisciplinary MFA. It is good for many different types of practice, and there are many applications for the idea of regenerative culture. I also want to mention that most of our students are on scholarship of some kind, and these are merit-based scholarships. So keep that in mind as you're considering applying. I'm going to hand it over now. It's been really nice to talk to you, and please do ask all of your questions after Caroline gives her presentation. So Caroline, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so hi again, everyone. Let me get out of the slideshow and stop sharing my screen so that I can get back to Caroline.
It seems like it's working. Can you all hear me?
I can hear you, and I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, hey everyone. I know that you've been listening for a little while and you might want to ask a lot of questions. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat window. You'll see it to the right. You might have to click on something to make it visible. And I'll be relatively brief so we can get into the Q&A and hear from Christy Gass as well. My name is Caroline Willard. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and an assistant professor at the University of Hartford. And it's a real pleasure to teach in the Nomad 9 MFA program because there's a very unique kind of student who attends. They tend to be students who are really alive to their own curiosity. And what I mean by that is they're not looking for conventional assignments or a conventional career path in the visual arts with, say, one kind of practice for a gallery. They are people who make all kinds of things, as you've just seen, what Carol showed you. And they're really interested in visiting places and learning from local artists in those places. So, for example, I teach 2 of the residencies that then are followed up with online coursework. One of them is in June, typically, in the summer residency in New York City, where I'm based most of the time. And it's a course that's on the solidarity economy, or sometimes we call it creative economies. The idea is that you can connect practices like worker-owned businesses with credit unions and community land trusts to the arts, and to think about how, as an artist, you want to work in relationship to a political economy and become more familiar with terms like a commodity or labor, and to be able to use that in your own practice. So we visit groups like Meerkat in New York City. It's a worker-owned filmmaking business. And last summer, for example, students learned how to create a high-quality podcast with Meerkat. So they're both thinking about worker-owned businesses and learning from a worker-owned business to make this podcast, interviewing artists about the economies of their own art practice, including the artist Aki Sasimoto, who is a performance artist and now head of the sculpture department at Yale. So that's what happens in the Creative or Solidarity Economy course. It helps students think about their own professional practices while giving them the tools to think about what an economy might be and what economies they want to create in their work as artists. The second course that I'll briefly describe is in the spring. It's a residency in Miami for the Art and Place Reconsidered course. So we visit Miami right now. We're planning for the February winter residency. I'll be there with art historian Amanda Carlson, and we'll visit a number of artists that she knows. She also grew up in Florida, so knows Miami quite well. And then online we'll follow up where students are going to make a place-based art proposal. So I can really help you all think through what it means to make a proposal that's place-based and how to do that in an equitable and ethical way when working with a place that you might not be familiar with yourself. What methods you might use to get to know a place and think through what your relationship is to that place. So that's a quick overview of the 2 courses I teach. I'm one of many faculty members here, as you saw. So you can ask me or Christy questions, and I'm excited to hear from you either in the chat or by audio. We'll see how it goes. Thanks so much.